So we're going to talk today about credibility assessments in women's asylum claims, and that's something that we at Asylum Aid feel really strongly about, because when we did some research, we found, both actually in Europe and in the UK, we found that the key reason that women were being refused asylum was because of having a negative credibility assessment. And in fact, we also found that if you were a woman, you were more likely to have your refusal overturned on appeal than if you were a man. So there was this disproportionate impact. And I wrote up our concerns around it in a book called Gender and Refugee Law. And I thought that it'd be really good if we could get the information that's in here out in a more accessible way, so in this film, and particularly to decision makers and to legal representatives, because we've come up with a theory as to why there is this disproportionate impact that I thought people would be interested in, and that focuses on three factors. I actually call them hurdles, because they're really hurdles for the women when they're claiming asylum. And the first is to do with not having documentary evidence, not having corroborative evidence for their claim. And the second is that because they don't have the documentary evidence, they're forced back onto their oral testimony, and yet they find it very difficult to explain everything that's happened to them. And the third factor is about the standard of proof and whether the correct standard of proof is being used. And we believe that an interaction of all those factors is what causes women to receive negative credibility assessments, and so to fall at each of those hurdles. So I thought it'd be good to start with you, Princess, and for you to be able to tell us what it's like for women who are in the asylum process to be disbelieved in this way.
It is horrible, absolutely horrible, because most of these women, as you know, are traumatized women already. They are coming from very troubled backgrounds, rape, abuses, domestic abuse, war, you name it. And they came, and the body language of the person asking the question or whatever they're asking is, why have you come? I don't think you're here to work or to do whatever. You don't have a real problem. You don't have a real, there are no issues. You're just lying. And once panic sets in, she confuses the date. She wouldn't remember the sequence of events. When you start panicking and mixing up the dates, it's like a vicious circle. And sometimes I've heard some women give up. So there's a kind of disconnection. Yeah. You kind of think, what is the point? This person does not believe me. I made a mistake. I called 2 different dates that is different from one. I mean, this is just life. And the traumatized person and an anxious woman, and so many of them with mental health issues, and the fear of just being questioned. This is your life playing out before you.
So the sense of not being believed actually then makes the woman so anxious that she starts, her answers become more confused, and then that makes you disbelieved even more in that vicious circle.
Yeah, and you lose confidence in yourself.
So from a legal point of view, Kate, why is credibility so important?
Credibility is absolutely central to refugee status determination, because it goes to whether or not a woman has a well-founded fear of being persecuted, and the particular legal test that has to be applied in refugee cases, which is whether or not that if a woman was returned to her country of origin, she'd face a real risk of persecution, torture, or some other form of serious harm. A woman's account of past experiences of violence or harm goes directly towards whether or not her assessment of whether or not she's at future risk can be believed, can be justified, can be accepted. What that means is that as part of the process of deciding someone's asylum claim, if there are doubts as to whether or not what a woman has said about what brought her to the UK, about what had happened to her in her country of origin, those doubts are used to form the basis of saying that actually a woman's assessment of whether or not she would face harm or persecution on return can also be doubted. I think what happens is that credibility assessment is used to obscure the central issue, which is what the legal basis of women's claims for protection are in the UK. And instead of focusing on whether or not someone has a well-founded fear of being persecuted and what that harm is, what the convention ground is, instead decision makers get bogged down in issues of, well, she said this on this occasion, this on another, and so we can put aside entirely all of these questions about whether or not she's entitled to protection.
So we've talked about the hurdles that women face in terms of credibility assessments, and that the first one is about lack of documentary evidence. So why would it be more difficult for a woman to have some sort of documentary evidence than for a man?
It is more difficult for women to have evidence because it's difficult to have evidence, documentary evidence for rape, for domestic violence, for horrible widowhood practices. There's some of a woman fleeing from war, and you don't have evidence to prove this. So, that's it.
And the other thing that you don't have evidence for, as well as the issues around, gender-based violence, as you've described, is that women are sometimes involved politically, and they may or may not have documentary evidence of that. So you might have a woman who's, in some countries, you're less likely as a woman to be the person who's leading the demonstration or who's in the newspaper report, or you might have been doing the sort of support roles like making uniforms or providing food and shelter, and not having a membership card. And the other thing that happens to women is that thing about having political opinions imputed to you, so that people think that because of your husband or your father or your brother has certain political opinions, that you must have the same ones. So there's so in those cases you also wouldn't have documentary evidence because of your low-level political activity, or because it isn't actually your own political activity. So given what Princess and I have said about the difficulties of women providing documentary evidence, whose obligation is it to provide that sort of corroborative evidence?
This is a really interesting point, because under international refugee law, it's actually a shared obligation between the decision maker and the refugee claimant. So what that means is that it's for the person claiming asylum to provide whatever corroborating evidence they have, and sometimes that might be straightforward. It might be something like a party membership card, but as we've said, that could be very problematic in women's cases. So often a legal representative might have to look to other sources for the provision of corroborative evidence. That might be, for example, an expert medical report, or an anthropologist, or someone who's familiar with a political organisation who could give evidence either to the Home Office or to the tribunal about what women's roles might be under particular circumstances. For the decision maker, it means that it's their responsibility to see what evidence they have available to them that might be used to support an applicant's case. That might be things like country of origin information. It might be evidence that's available to the tribunal in forms of expert evidence, for example. What decision makers have to be careful about, though, is not being concerned that a gap in that evidence means that there is no corroboration available to a woman's case. What I mean by that is that we know that country of origin information can be very partial when it comes to, for example, women's economic status, women's political involvement. It might be very partial about particular groups of women who might be subjected to particular forms of gender-based violence that women in the broader community in that country are not subject to. So the fact that there isn't evidence on something doesn't mean that a woman's voice, as you've so powerfully articulated, shouldn't be the overriding thing that the tribunal is listening to, or that the decision maker is listening to, because international refugee law makes clear that because an applicant's testimony has to be treated with care and respect, there shouldn't be a requirement placed on applicants in all circumstances to produce corroborative evidence.
So because a woman's less likely to have documentary evidence to support her story, she's forced back onto her oral testimony, and that's really a second hurdle for a woman to get over. What are the difficulties with relying on oral testimony for assessment of credibility?
I think that there are 4 reasons why assessing credibility from a woman's oral testimony can be really problematic. I think the first one goes to plausibility and implausibility. And what I've often read in women's cases is that her account of violence is implausible, particularly, for example, if it references experiences around rape, sexual violence, female genital mutilation, or particular forms of harm that decision makers might not have experience in dealing with. When you're looking at countries where there is conflict and where there are widespread human rights abuses, those are forms of behaviour that are inherently irrational and implausible, and so a woman's account should not be dismissed as being irrational or implausible because it doesn't fit with what a decision maker thinks a woman's life or behaviour or case from that particular country should be like, or how it should relate to. The other problem in women's cases is women's knowledge being tested. And often this can be problematic because in, for example, religious cases, women might be asked questions about the particular practice of their religion or particular texts or their interpretation. And that is information that might not be shared with women or might not be relevant to women's practice of their religion. It might be based on a male model of religious observance. There is no benchmark of knowledge that women can be assessed against that's culturally appropriate or acceptable. So assessing on the basis of testing women's knowledge is problematic. The third issue relates to women's demeanour, particularly in cases where women are traumatised. And again, there is no way of behaving if you have experienced rape. There is no way of behaving if you've been forced into prostitution. So saying that you can believe someone or not on the basis of what they say and how they behave when they say it is deeply problematic. The fourth thing I just want to highlight is late disclosure. And again, this is particularly relevant in women's cases where women might not feel comfortable in saying that they've, for example, been raped or been forced into prostitution immediately at the outset, either with their lawyer or with the decision maker.
So, given what Kate's been saying about how difficult it is for women to explain what's happened to them and to tell everything, what are the difficulties for women? How do they feel about it?
Women feel about terrible shame. They feel, embarrassed, and most of these women come from countries where you don't talk about certain things, where it is the culture is acceptable for these things to happen because to you as a woman, and you can't just talk about it, more so talking to a total stranger. And this thing, just like Kate pointed out, the fact that these women are telling their stories, and it sounds a bit unbelievable, or you can't believe them because it doesn't sound real. Could this have happened to somebody? Does not mean that it hasn't happened. So each time for this woman it is real. And when you're asking that question, every single question is like driving in a knife, and each question is like turning it right deeper and deeper, and the woman is thoroughly traumatized. And of course, there goes all manner of emotions. Confusion, she forgets herself, she's panicking, she's anxious, and she may not even remember the way things has happened or what's happened. Sometimes there's a complete block, every emotions, and asking these questions, especially for gender-based violence and very traumatic experiences, is like they have their own coping mechanism. And this is a woman who has managed to cope up until she gets to where she is now, and you're going back to what she's trying to block out. It's like reopening very fresh wounds.
Gosh,
and that could be terrible for anybody. Especially women.
So you get the sense that the trauma of what's happened to her then makes it causes shame, affects her memory, makes it much more difficult to explain what's happened to her, and then that becomes like the second hurdle then that women are having to get over to get their narrative across. Okay.
Kate, well, by the way, I am a lawyer, and at least as far as I know, there are certain, proofs that is required of a particular case, be it criminal, be it civil, and so on. And I know that for civil cases, it is balance of probability, and in criminal cases, as you know as well, it's beyond all reasonable doubts. We know that level of proof. What is the level of proof for refugee cases?
The legal issue is whether or not a person's fear of persecution is well founded or not. And because we're dealing with persecution, which is such a form of serious harm, courts from around the world, and it's also the case that within the European asylum law, a very low standard of proof has been set in comparison with the two standards that you've identified, the normal civil and criminal standards. So in refugee claims, what we're looking at is whether or not there's a real risk that there's going to be persecution or some other form of serious harm. And there are other kind of forms of words that have been used in the case law to get at this idea of real risk. One of those is reasonable likelihood, one of them is reasonable grounds for thinking that. I would say in general in the British cases, we're looking at whether or not someone faces a real risk of being persecuted for some form of persecution or other serious harm. Whilst I've said that that's a very low standard in comparison with either the civil or criminal law tests that you've identified. It's unfortunately the case that that appears to be applied much too rigorously. In fact, I'm aware of linked trafficking cases where someone who's found to be credible at the criminal standard of proof in a criminal trial has not been believed when it's come to their asylum case, when the standard of proof being applied is significantly lower. And I think one of the central issues in asylum cases is therefore the misapplication of this very low standard of proof.
So we've talked about how credibility is affected by three factors that interact. So because women are more likely than men to have to be escaping gender-based persecution, they're less likely to have documentary evidence. And because they're not having that evidence, they're forced back onto their oral testimony, and that's affected by the shame and trauma that you were describing, Princess. And then those factors are made worse if the standard of proof is misinterpreted. So this interaction results in women failing to obtain a positive credibility assessment. So what can we do, Kate, to prevent women falling at these hurdles?
I think there are some things that legal reps can do which might assist. I think first of all, ideally, before an asylum interview, the legal rep should meet with the woman to outline with her what the process involves and the importance of disclosing as much as possible the first time they speak to a decision maker at the Home Office. It might be useful, it might be possible in some cases to put together a witness statement that could found the asylum interview and to enable the woman to tell the clearest, best possible account of her experiences in her country of origin. Accessing other support services might be very beneficial as well. Some women might benefit from counselling or from being introduced to other groups of women who might be able to support them, because that kind of level of peer-to-peer support through the process might be beneficial and enable women to talk confidently or more confidently to the decision maker at the Home Office. Legal reps can also look to other sources of support. So we've talked a bit about medical reports, but there are other people who might be able to assist. There are experts, for example, in violence against women and gender-based violence who can provide very compelling evidence at tribunal level about, for example, the impact of particular forms of violence against women on their ability to discuss it and to be able to take part even in legal proceedings. In terms of decision makers, I think decision makers need to be aware that adverse credibility findings or refusals on the basis of an adverse credibility findings can be open to challenge in particular circumstances. What they need to do to make sure that their decision is one that would stand up is to ensure that they give the asylum seeking women the opportunity to rebut anything that has given rise to that negative credibility finding. So for example, if a woman does give two different dates, as you described might happen, Princess, earlier, the decision maker should simply put that to the woman. You said, on the one hand you said this, on the other hand you said that. Could you elaborate? Could you explain why? If the decision maker doesn't give a woman the opportunity to correct any mistakes that she's made in her evidence or in her testimony, that's something that could be challenged on appeal. Similarly, any issues with credibility have to relate to the asylum claim itself, and it's important that things, for example, about a woman's journey to the UK or about family members, that findings on credibility in relation to those issues don't obscure the central issue, which is whether or not a woman has a well-founded fear of being persecuted. There's a final safeguard in this process, which is that even if someone is found to be incredible in particular circumstances, they may still have a claim for international protection that the decision maker still has to deal with. And it's possible for a decision maker to find, for example, that a woman is incredible about a particular aspect of her case, but that decision maker still then has to go through the proper process to determine that claim. And in particular circumstances, it may be that she should still be granted refugee status or some other form of subsidiary protection.
So we've talked a lot, obviously, about this not being believed as part of credibility, and I thought it'd be interesting to know, Princess, how you think it would, what would happen really if a woman went into her asylum interview and felt that she was believed. How would that change things?
It will change things drastically and dramatically as well, and it will be wonderful if that will be the case. Because when a woman has that sense of being believed, she drops her guard. It's just like what we are having right now. It becomes a very, very, good exchange, wonderful, normal exchange, telling your story, which she knows very well, and another person listening to that story. The emotions, the right emotions come out. She was able to remember more things. She's able to say more details about what, describe it more, feeling, being encouraged to disclose more. There are so many things will come out. It becomes very, very, and then empathy will be shown, because when a good story or a sad story is being told, an honest story is being told, then empathy automatically comes out. And when this woman gets all of this, she gives her all. She says everything. And just like we have said before, instead of it being a vicious cycle of the trauma and, everything put together, all of the bad emotions, it becomes a positive, cycle.
So we could replace the vicious circle with the positive circle.
Exactly.
That sounds really good. So I think our discussion has really demonstrated that women face particular disadvantages in credibility assessment. And at Asylum Aid, we really hope that our research and this film will assist asylum professionals on this issue.